Some moments in football history aren't defined by the trophy at stake. They're defined by what a single player proves about themselves when everything suggests they should fail. On March 23, 2018, at the Letzigrund Stadion in Zurich, Cristiano Ronaldo was about to deliver exactly that kind of moment. Not because Portugal was chasing a World Cup title, not because the entire nation's fate hung in the balance, but because Ronaldo had never accepted the word impossible, and Egypt was about to learn why that matters. This was a friendly match, an international fixture that meant nothing in terms of tournament progression. And yet, what would unfold in 90 minutes would become one of the most talked about moments of Ronaldo's career. Portugal came into this friendly match as one of the most dominant forces in European football. They were on the back of winning the Confederations Cup just months earlier. They were loaded with talent. They had rhythm. They had confidence. They had everything that should guarantee victory against an Egyptian team that was being written off by virtually every analyst before the match even began. But confidence in football is a double-edged sword. And on this particular evening, that confidence would be tested in ways that nobody expected. Because Egypt, a team that had no business competing at this level according to the conventional wisdom, had shown up with something far more dangerous than raw talent. They showed up with hunger, with tactical discipline, with a game plan that was specifically designed to disrupt Portugal's usual attacking patterns, with a strategy that made Portugal's brilliant flowing attack look pedestrian and predictable. The first half belonged to Egypt, not in terms of possession statistics, which would have favored Portugal massively, not in terms of chance creation, where Portugal would have dominated the expected goals data, but in terms of what truly matters in football: execution and clinical finishing. Egypt's defensive structure was absolutely impeccable. They pressed at precisely the right moments, cutting off Portugal's midfield passing lanes before they could develop. They covered space with remarkable intelligence, understanding exactly when to compress the field and when to drop deeper. And they created something that Portugal's coaching staff clearly wasn't prepared for. They created genuine doubt. They created confusion. They created the possibility that Portugal might not win this match. By the halfway point, Egypt had taken the lead through a goal that came from exactly what happens when a team loses concentration for just a moment. It was a goal born from sloppy defending, from a moment of complacency, from Portugal's concentration lapsing for precisely long enough for their opponent to exploit the space and punish them with ruthless efficiency. 1-0 to Egypt. And the stadium, which had expected a Portuguese coronation, a routine victory that would be forgotten within days, suddenly went quiet. The energy shifted. The atmosphere changed. Because this wasn't supposed to happen. Portugal wasn't supposed to be chasing this match. They weren't supposed to need a comeback against an Egyptian team. They weren't supposed to be fighting for a result in what was meant to be a simple warm-up fixture. But that's exactly what was unfolding before everyone's eyes. And as the second half approached, it was about to get significantly worse. Because Egypt came out of the interval with even more conviction and belief than they'd shown in the first 45 minutes. They had tasted blood. They had proven conclusively that they could compete with one of Europe's finest teams. And rather than retreating into a defensive shell, they pushed forward with confidence. They extended their advantage, 2-0. Portugal was now in genuine trouble, not because Egypt was technically superior to them on the pitch, not because Egypt's players were more skilled individually, but because Egypt had something that often matters more than pure technical ability at this level. They had belief. They had momentum. They had the psychological advantage that comes with leading by 2 goals against a team that everyone expected to demolish them. And in football, belief in moments like these, momentum in critical situations, is often enough to overcome class difference. And that's when Ronaldo, who had been relatively quiet for most of the first hour of this match, who had been marked carefully and covered intelligently by Egypt's defense with their entire tactical structure built around neutralizing him, suddenly became the only thing that mattered. Not because he suddenly became more talented, not because he suddenly had more technical ability than he'd displayed in the first 60 minutes, but because of something that cannot be measured on a statistics sheet. Because when a team is losing, and the pressure mounts exponentially and the clock starts ticking down toward inevitable defeat, it's not always the most technically gifted player that makes the difference. It's the player with the biggest mentality, the player who refuses to accept that the match is over, the player who understands intuitively that impossibility is just a word that people use before something extraordinary happens. It's the player who has spent an entire career proving that when the stakes are highest and the odds are longest, that's precisely when he performs. Ronaldo scored. A goal that wasn't particularly spectacular in its execution. A goal that didn't require a moment of individual genius or technical wizardry that would make highlight reels for years. but a goal that carried enormous psychological weight. It carried the weight of a nation's belief returning. It carried the momentum shift that comes when a team that's been dominated suddenly finds a lifeline. 2-1. Egypt was still ahead. The scoreboard still told a story of a Portugal team losing to an opponent they were universally supposed to demolish. But something fundamental had shifted in that moment, because Ronaldo had scored, and every person in the stadium knew what that meant. It meant there was still hope. It meant the comeback from 2 down wasn't impossible anymore. It meant they just needed one more goal. It meant that Egypt's advantage, which had seemed insurmountable just moments earlier, was suddenly fragile. And that's when Egypt made their critical mistake. Not a mistake in defensive positioning, not a mistake in their tactical shape, but a mistake in their mentality, a mistake that would prove fatal to their chances of holding on to their advantage. Because when you're leading by 2 goals against a team that contains Cristiano Ronaldo, and the momentum suddenly shifts even slightly in your opponent's favor, you have to be absolutely ruthless in your response. You have to extend your advantage immediately. You have to understand with complete clarity that your opponent now has a weapon that very few teams in world football possess, a man who refuses to accept defeat. And Egypt, in that crucial moment, didn't do that. They didn't show that ruthlessness. Instead, they retreated into themselves. They became defensive-minded. They started thinking about protecting their advantage rather than aggressively extending it. They started playing not to lose rather than playing to win. And in football, that's often when the best teams find their opportunities. That's often the precise moment when the greatest players deliver their most significant moments. That's often when history gets written by those who refuse to accept the narrative that's been written for them. The pressure built relentlessly. Portugal pressed higher up the pitch with increasing desperation and intensity. Their urgency increased. Their commitment increased. And Egypt, instead of rising to meet that intensity with their own intensity, started to show visible signs of cracking under the pressure. You could see it in their body language on the pitch. You could see it in the quality of their passing, which became increasingly hurried and imprecise. You could see it in the way they were starting to make critical defensive errors that hadn't been present earlier in the match. Because playing against Cristiano Ronaldo, when he's desperate to prove something, when he's been written off and counted out, when his team is facing defeat, is one of the hardest tasks in football. Because he never stops moving. He never accepts defeat as inevitable. He never allows his team to die without fighting every second for redemption. And then it came. The moment that would define this entire match. The moment that would be the only thing anyone remembered from this supposedly routine, friendly fixture. Portugal created a chance. It wasn't the most clear-cut opportunity in football. It wasn't a dead duck situation in front of goal with the goalkeeper stranded. But it was a moment where absolutely everything hung in the balance, where one team had the chance to extend their lead to 3 goals and effectively seal the victory beyond any doubt, where another team had the chance to equalize and transform the entire narrative of this match, and Ronaldo was in that moment, because he's always in those moments. Because throughout his entire career, spanning nearly 2 decades at the absolute peak of football, he has developed this almost supernatural ability to position himself in situations where he can change the entire narrative, where he can be the single difference between victory and defeat, where he can transform a moment of potential crisis and humiliation into a moment of personal redemption and collective triumph. He struck the ball with authority. And what happened next was the reason why this match will be remembered as historic. Not because of the overall quality of football displayed, not because of the tactical sophistication or strategic brilliance shown by either team, but because of what it represented. Because Ronaldo equalized. Portugal equalized. The impossible comeback that had seemed impossible just minutes earlier was now complete. 2-2. The stadium didn't just erupt. It exploded. The noise was deafening. The atmosphere was transformed. But this wasn't the end of the story. This wasn't the final chapter. Because somehow, impossibly, Portugal pushed forward once more. The momentum was now entirely with the Portuguese team. Egypt was visibly broken. They had the lead and they'd surrendered it. They had possessed the advantage and they'd allowed it to slip away. And when a team loses that psychological advantage, especially against an opponent that includes Cristiano Ronaldo in their ranks, especially when they'd been the ones holding the initiative, they're essentially finished. The belief disappears. The conviction evaporates. The hope that had driven them for 70 minutes disappears. Portugal scored again, a goal that put them ahead for the first time in the match, 2-1. Portugal. And this time, it was final. This time, it was the ending that the narrative demanded. This time, it was the conclusion that felt inevitable once Ronaldo had equalized. Because this wasn't just about a friendly match being played in Switzerland on a March evening. This was about a player refusing to accept defeat even when everything and everyone suggested that defeat was inevitable. This was about a team learning how to overcome what seemed like insurmountable adversity. This was about the fundamental difference between accepting that you're beaten and actually fighting every second to prove that you're not. When the final whistle came, when Portugal had finally secured their victory, the celebration that followed wasn't one of pure joy and exhilaration. It was one of relief. Relief that they hadn't allowed this match to completely slip away from their grasp. Relief that Ronaldo had delivered in the moment it mattered most. Relief that they had proven something about themselves that maybe, deep down, they needed to prove. Relief that they weren't going to be remembered as the team that lost to Egypt. But for anyone watching this match, anyone who understood football at a deep level, the real lesson was fundamentally different. The real lesson was that football isn't played by statistics sheets. It isn't won by the team that should win based on pre-match analysis. It isn't determined by which team looks better on paper or has more talented individual players. It's won by the team that believes they can win when everything and everyone suggests they shouldn't. It's won by the player who refuses to accept that the match is truly over until the final whistle has blown. It's won by the mentality that can turn a seemingly hopeless 2-goal deficit into a complete turnaround and victory. Ronaldo had delivered exactly that kind of performance. Not through scoring a dramatic hat trick that would make everyone forget the rest of the match. Not through a display of pure technical wizardry and individual brilliance, but through the simple, powerful refusal to accept defeat. Through the understanding that a match doesn't truly end until it ends. Through the unwavering belief that impossible is just a word that people use before something extraordinary happens. And as the players walked off the pitch at full time, as Portugal celebrated their improbable comeback, as Egypt learned an incredibly hard lesson about what happens when you release the pressure and psychological intensity against the best player in the world, one thing became absolutely clear to everyone. This wasn't just a friendly match anymore. This wasn't a match that would be forgotten in a week. This was a moment, a defining moment. A moment that proved why Ronaldo had spent his entire career at the absolute pinnacle of football, competing against the world's best. A moment that proved why he will be remembered as one of the greatest players who ever lived. Not just for his statistics, but for moments exactly like this. Because history isn't written by the teams that are supposed to win based on conventional wisdom. It's written by the moments when someone refuses to let their team lose. It's written by the players who understand with complete clarity that the only time a match is truly finished is when the referee blows the final whistle. And Ronaldo understood that principle better than anyone on that pitch on that night. 2-1. Portugal. The impossible comeback complete. Another historic moment delivered, and another unforgettable chapter added to the ever-growing legend of Cristiano Ronaldo.